Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening to Madam and also everyone in the class. So I'm Arfan, and together with my group mates, Dini Adriana and Firdaus, we will be presenting on our topic today, which is poverty is caused by an unjust social hierarchy. So first off, I would like to start with some facts and the situation at hand. So today there are approximately 1 billion people still finding it hard to come out of poverty. And every year since the last 2 decades, the poverty rate has dropped 1 percent point, over 3 times the annual rate globally over the last 200 years. And to compare it with a decade ago, people used to survive on only a quarter a day, whereas a third of the world population today live on more than $10 per day, as mentioned by Roser in 2013. This growth can be seen as slight progress, but it surely isn't an ideal one. Now, before we dive further into our presentation, I will be highlighting on the important definitions on what our topic today is about. So, firstly is the definition of the main issue that surrounds our essay, which is poverty. Poverty can be divided into two. The first is absolute poverty, which was defined by Kudel et al. In 2002 as poverty below an official line set at the absolute standard of what households should be able to count on in order to meet their basic needs. Basically, it examines on the basic resources of what a household should need and whether or not they are able to have access to those resources. The second part of poverty is relative poverty, and it is quite similar to absolute poverty, but what differs between these two definitions of poverty is that relative poverty is defined as in the context of all the people living concurrently in a particular society, whereas absolute poverty only concerns a particular household alone. Our topic for today will be talking about poverty in the context of social hierarchy. We believe that the existing social hierarchy has created a divide between social classes, which subsequently has led to the poverty that we see today. But before we explain to you why, to give a definition, social hierarchy means the ranking of members along a valued dimension, with some members being superior or subordinate to others, while few members conquering the highest positions, as defined by Koski et al. In 2015. And to make you understand better, I have made an illustration here. How social hierarchy works is that those at the top of the social chain will be afforded more resources and benefits than others, which signifies dominance, thus influencing morbidity and mortality. On the other hand, as you can see, the less fortunate sitting at the bottom over there gets treated the complete opposite, like having access to less resources. This social class divides people into the superficial groups based on their socio-economic factors like wealth, income, race, education, ethnicity, gender, occupation, social status, or derived power. This shows that there is an injustice happening here between these social classes, and keeping things as it is will only further romanticize the issue of poverty. One of the United Nations' goal is to eliminate poverty by the year 2030, but poverty is not the root of the problem here. The unjust social hierarchy is, among many other things. So in other words, poverty should not be seen as an issue by itself, rather a product of collective social miseries, as mentioned by Asari in 2017. So if the UN wants to eradicate the issue of poverty once and for all, they should first tackle these smaller issues that are contributing to it.
As for the Islamic perspective for poverty eradication, we will refer to this hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, which reads, "The Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, the strong is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, although both are good. Strive for that which will benefit you, seek the help of Allah." Islam encourages the followers to put effort in reducing the disparity, but it never asks its followers to relent it. They must strive to be productive in actions that are legitimate with the Sharia compliances. This can be done by means of participating in economic activities which help generate income. The Prophet emphasizes that it is better to gain from your own efforts with hard work, and by doing so, one can become a strong Muslim that can benefit for oneself, one's family, and for one's community. So therefore, they must be responsible for the improvement of their own well-being.
Now, on to our first main idea, which is poverty is a product of the huge income inequality gap between two classes of the social spectrum. Based on this illustration I've made, Myers reported that the average global adult earns about $23,380. In this report, they came out with two observations, which is in view of global income and also global wealth. In the illustration, the most top quartile is known as the wealthiest 10% of the world's population, and they account for 52% of the total global income, which is equivalent to $122,000. On the other hand, the poorest half of the world's population earns only about 8%, which is calculated as $3,900. In terms of wealth, the numbers are way more disappointing. The poorest half of the world's population owns only about 2% of the world's total wealth, and the wealthiest 10%, they own 76% of the total wealth. The difference is bizarre, and this is enough proof to show that the rich are hoarding the majority of the wealth and income in the world, leaving the poor with nothing but scraps to sustain their life. In the long run, this unhealthy financial and wealth gap between the rich and the poor will only deprive the opportunity for low-income families to invest in their livelihoods in terms of education and skills, because having access to these things can give them the opportunity to alter the fate of their present and future. I have provided another illustration to make us understand the situation better. So, from being born in a rich family or financially stable household, they are provided with countless of resources, and some might even say endless. Growing up, they are sent to good schools, get good tutors or teachers, and in fact, statistics says that in most countries, children coming from middle class and wealthy families do better in school. They are more likely to get placements in higher education institutions and eventually secure high-paying jobs to later on earn more as adults. Later on, when they get married and have kids, the cycle continues, as their children will also be born with a silver spoon. So I'm basically saying that in most cases, being rich is a cycle. You were once a product of the so-called wealthy cycle, and when you grow up and have your own families, you will continue to contribute to that cycle. However, different can be said for the poor. They have to start working 10 times harder in school at an early age to reach the same standard as those who are more fortunate than them, but with 10 times less resources. And even so, that does not guarantee them a stable future. If they work hard enough, they may get special opportunities to help their families and have a better life, but if that's not the case, they would have to continue to live in poverty with a low-paying job and an average income to make ends meet. Even if when they are all grown up and working and have built a family of their own, it does not guarantee that they will ever get as rich as those who were born rich. Apart from the existing income inequality gap, most of these poor families do not even have jobs to help sustain their families because of the unemployment rate. A report by CNBC reported that unemployment rate in lower income families has increased to 21%, and households with an average income of $150,000 a year have an employment rate of 3.2% only. The numbers are really far apart here. The report also states that more middle-income workers are now forced into working lower-wage jobs, which means that they are replacing those low-income workers who became unemployed. As a result, low-wage jobs are catered towards low-income families because of restricted job opportunities, as the high-paying jobs are dominated by the wealthy or the middle and upper class because they are more qualified and well-suited for it. When the low-wage jobs are occupied, some may even be left unemployed, or if they are not at all suited for it, because even working in low-wage jobs require specific basic qualifications and requirements. At the end of the day, the rich will always have savings from the past, or some might even have generational wealth as a safety net to sustain them in times of crisis. The poor, however, are less likely to say the same. In the end, it is always the same group of people finding themselves stuck in the unfortunate life cycle of poverty. Lastly, before I end my part of the presentation, I would like to just say that we constantly preach in fear of a dystopian future, but in reality, there is no dystopian future because, as a matter of fact, we are already living in one. So yeah, I'll pass the floor to Firdaus for the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Next, poverty is influenced by the existence of double standards within a social class. Social classes can be divided into 5 distinct types, which are the chronic poor, the transient poor, the non-poor, the middle class, and the elite. As for the transient poor class, it is in the state of near poverty, which means that a sudden decline in the economy could result in them entering poverty. The middle class, however, the middle class and the elite are way beyond the poverty line and have no problems in terms of financial income, which makes them the wealthiest of the bunch. In order to understand this part, we'll have to take a look at social stratification. Now, you might be asking, what is social stratification? It is defined as different actors having unequal access to all aspects of rewards in a society. These rewards can consist of opportunity for social mobility, gaining valued resources, services, and also position in a society. Such a system has existed for many, many generations in various foundations, such as the public institutions like the government, the education institutions, which are also embedded in the education system, and much more. Social stratification is heavily influenced by an individual's race, his gender, religion, education level, and even family inheritance. An example of how race influences social stratification can be seen in the discrimination of Black people in the United States. From numerous studies, it has always been clear that the African Americans always get the short end of the stick. An example of this is when they get denied of admission towards entering higher educational institutions. These institutions would most likely prioritize the white Americans regardless of their level of achievements. This would result in the Black Americans having difficulty in getting a job or being employed. Similarly, they would most likely be blacklisted by these job companies anyways. And even if they do get hired, they would definitely be paid less than the whites or have fewer benefits in comparison.
Hi, my name is Nurina Adriana, and I'll be continuing on our third main idea, which is poverty is caused by the government's irresponsibility and ignorance toward the poor that caused the issue to be a never-ending cycle. If we look onto the current issue, which is the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing now, that is slowly going on to the endemic phase, we may see insufficient attention to the needs and conditions of the poorer citizens in various reactions to the COVID-19 outbreak. So for example, if we focus on Malaysia, we can see that most help was done by the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. And these people, although with insufficient funds and tools, they collectively came out with the idea of Kita Jaga Kita program due to the government's incompetence of looking out for the people, and the government, knowing that these people will eventually help, made them care even less for the poor. This is very heartbreaking to see the level of mistrust that Malaysians have for their own government, and it is hardly unexpected given what brought everyone here. The betrayal, selfishness, ignorance, reactionariness, slowness, and incompetence are all the words that we can use to describe this distrust people have towards the government. So Malaysia, which has one of the world's largest cabinets with over 70 ministerial and deputy ministerial roles as well as special salaries, is nevertheless very slow when it comes to priority, urgency, and coordination. And perhaps the problem is not incompetence, but rather a lack of political will and urgency to really do the work and serve the people. And when they come back to the people clamoring for votes after they lose power, perhaps we should just put them where they belong. If we focus on Malaysia's government and look onto another recent issue that happened recently, which is the flood, Malaysia was in the midst of one of the worst floods in decades. Over 120,000 people were displaced and 54 people were reported killed. And while all this catastrophe were happening, while people chilled and starved, the government stood by, played tourists, cut cake, had fireworks, had fun, had celebrations. And according to analysts, the lack of a crisis management system, political incompetence, polarization, and concerns like illegal logging demonstrate a lack of leadership, and Malaysia is still far from being prepared to deal with the repercussions of climate change. And government's lack of care towards the climate change is interrelated to their ignorance towards the poor, due to the fact that they only care what happens among them or what may affect them. So when the people were struggling with their homes being destroyed during the flood and not much of a financial assistance after the flood, the government still turned a blind eye on the hardships of the people when they are supposed to serve people. To conclude, the existence of an income inequality gap between the classes in the social hierarchy gives rise to poverty, and individuals from the lower social category will most likely experience fatal hardships and will have to face more difficult challenges in order to gain the same privileges as those who were born in wealth.
Moving on, the never-ending cycle of poverty is a result of government negligence towards the poor. As we've seen previously, the NGOs have given the most help towards the poor compared to the government due to their incompetence. This act of ignorance should be looked down upon, since the sole purpose of the government should be to serve their people. Overall, the issue of poverty has yet to be solved, considering that the amount of people living in poverty today is still quite high. Efforts to reduce it must be prioritized, as its rapid growth today is still continues to increase even as I'm speaking at this moment. The rich will continue to gain benefits in which the low classes struggle to even get a glimpse of. The poor will also always struggle to fight for their survival and experience instability, which will expand the risk of them being unemployed and being in the state of poverty.
So we came out with suggestions. We came up with 3 suggestions. One of it being to implement higher tax on the rich that is reasonable and on par with their average income. And the second one would be to improve the accessibility of social services towards low-class people, and the evaluation on the government's incompetence. That is all from our group. Thank you so much for listening.